Lisa's going to be sitting right here in the front with her signs, okay?
Good evening.
Since 2009.
Welcome to First Parish. My name is Reverend Ann Mason, and I am the minister of this congregation, and I welcome you. I'm glad to see all of you here. We are offering this forum tonight because our denomination's support for the right to self-determination when dying began back in 1988 at our General Assembly when Unitarian Universalists voted to affirm our advocacy for people to have the medical support that they need in order to make their own decision regarding their death and in certain circumstances. And so as a denomination, we resolved to advocate for safeguards against abuses by those who would hasten death contrary to an individual's desires. And we resolved to act through our congregations to support legislation that will create legal protection for the right to die with dignity in accordance with one's own choice. So we are a denomination which allows for a variety of paths for an individual to choose what you want to believe, what's right for you. And we value being able to act on that belief in a path that works for you. As Unitarian Universalists, we uphold the worth and dignity of every person. And we actively advocate for freedom of thought and action, especially in controversial situations. So allowing one person to have the right to choose to accept medical aid when dying does not mean that someone who's opposed to this would be required to do so. Medical aid in dying refers to a medical practice in which a mentally capable, terminally ill adult with a prognosis of 6 months or fewer to live may request from their physician a prescription for a medication that they can take to peacefully pass in their sleep when and if their suffering becomes unbearable. As a minister, I have spent many years doing pastoral care with people in hospitals and in their homes. I have seen a wide variety of experience as that sacred moment approaches. I've seen people suffer with incredible physical and psychic pain as this time approaches, when they feel that they have no control over their own body, and their sense of helplessness then colors their experience. Much better have been the times when a person can open their eyes without fear and see what's coming, and choose to have their family with them to say goodbye, to experience that sacred moment of death with dignity. I will never forget the afternoon I spent at Hershey Medical Center with an elderly couple. Together, the family had decided with their doctor that this was the time and that there was nothing else that could be done for him. They called me in as I was the chaplain, and I sat with them for several hours that afternoon, and we were singing and praying and talking together. And I'll never forget the moment when he could no longer speak, but we were singing a hymn of his faith tradition, an old hymn called It Is Well With My Soul. And as we sang each verse, I could see his wife and he looking at each other. He was mouthing the words, and they were surrounded by love and faith and a confidence that they shared a life together, and they were choosing to see the end of his life with the beauty of their relationship holding them in that sacred moment. So I believe that all people have the right to establish that kind of an atmosphere for themselves. So I welcome you here to this. I hope that you will stay for a time of refreshments in Parish Hall. You can go through either door. There will be a time of offering from all of our panelists. And if you feel that you have a question that you want to ask, take one of the pens in the pews and write it down on the back of your paper, yellow paper, because there will be time for questions and answers. And I'll ask you to come up to this microphone and just line up, and then Senator Barrett will field all those questions for our panelists. So welcome, and thank you so much for being here.
Thank you very much, Reverend. My name is Mike Barrett. I'm the state senator for a good portion of Lexington and 8 other communities, and I'm drawn to this issue. I'm very happy to have been included, and drawn to it in part because as we get older, this becomes a human topic of interest for all of us. whether we're well or sick or very ill. I can tell you that I had a conversation today with a legislative colleague. I needed to hear from him very much yesterday. We're working on some energy legislation having to do with those gas explosions in Andover, North Andover, and Lawrence, and I couldn't get him yesterday. It was a critical day for him to have not been in touch with me, but he called today to say that he had been with an 88-year-old friend yesterday, that that friend had been ill for quite a while, had been a friend of his parents and now a friend of the legislators. The man, of course, wasn't able, because it's not legal in Massachusetts, to choose a time of dying, so he was dying on nature's schedule instead. And as it happened, my colleague was in the room with him when he passed yesterday, but the man's wife was not. The man's spouse of 48 years had been on her way, but the couple hadn't really been able to plan anything, and so she was not able to be with him in his final moments. It was fortunate that my colleague was. Otherwise, the gentleman would have been alone. We ought to have done something as a legislature to avoid situations like that. Bills have been introduced. Marie Manis knows about them since 2009 here in Massachusetts. Marie, who's with an organization called Compassion and Choices, worked on a 2012 initiative petition. The public here in Massachusetts was asked to weigh in on this complicated question. She can talk about the results of that 2012 initiative and give us some other background about this issue. Suffice it to say that when a bill's been introduced, even on a difficult topic, for 8 years, its moment is likely coming. I see promise appealing to conservatives here because this is a libertarian issue. I see the potential to appeal to progressives because this is a civil rights issue, perhaps the ultimate civil rights issue. So there's the possibility of making a reasoned argument that gives all of us control of our moments, more than the control that my friend's compatriot had yesterday. And with that, I want to introduce Marie Manis of Compassion and Choices, who knows more about this in the Massachusetts context than almost anyone else. Marie, good to have you with us.
Thank you, Senator. Can you all hear me? Am I mic'd? Okay, great. Now I hear myself. How many of you recall the 2012 question 2 Death with Dignity ballot? Okay, most of you do, okay. So at that time, we had great support across the state, some 68%, the polls showed some 68% of the people supported death with dignity or medical aid in dying. And in the last 3 weeks of the campaign, the opposition ran probably $3 or $4 million into the airwaves and ran television ads that were frightening and untrue. So people did get scared, and we lost by a very small margin, 2 points. It was 48,000 votes out of 2.8 million cast. So with that, it was real clear that the people of the state really wanted this to happen. So we partnered with Representative Lou Kafka, who had initially introduced the bill in 2009. There was no organization behind it, but he had a constituent. He's a Stoughton representative, and he had a constituent who had cancer and asked him to introduce that legislation, and he did. So we felt that after the ballot initiative that showed so much support that we wanted to partner with him to help, make it happen. And over the last 6 years, it went from, I think it was 5 co-sponsors on the bill in 2009, 15 in 2013 when we got on, when we started helping out. And it has grown over the last 6 years to 46 co-sponsors on the bill. That's almost a quarter of the entire legislature. We have across the state, if you read the papers, you read about medical aid and dying every other day. You read about death. We weren't even talking about death in 2012, and now you read about it every other day in the newspapers. It's not something that's in the closet anymore. People die, we're all going to die, so let's see how we plan everything else in our lives. We plan where we're going to school, who we're going to marry, where we're going to work, where we're going to live, you know, and we get to this important place and we don't have the ability to plan it. So that's an important piece of what our organization does, not just the medical aid in dying, but the planning, you know, helping people to do advanced directives and all those steps up to the end. So what has happened over the last 6 years is that we have built a lot of support. We have organizations that have signed on to support medical aid in dying, you know, National Association of Social Workers, the ACLU, you know, AIDS Action, CCALS, and other organizations. We have passed numerous resolutions in city councils and town councils in support of medical aid in dying. And right here in Lexington, the Board of Selectmen passed it several months, I think it was back in last December, unanimously passed a resolution to send on to the legislature to support medical aid in dying. Democratic town councils have sent letters, faith organizations, faith leaders, and faith congregations have sent letters. And this past December of 2017, the Massachusetts Medical Society, which is probably one of the most conservative societies within the American Medical Association, dropped they did a survey of their physicians in October and showed that 60% were in support. So in December, they had a meeting and they dropped their opposition and took on a position of neutral engagement. So that is huge.
Marie, why don't we move on and then return to some of the other political
Okay,
things? 'Cause
absolutely.
I know that people want to hear some of the
Yes.
other ways that they can help too. Our Amanda
I was
Bedanza.
going to tell them that just then, but that's okay.
Oh, I hear you. I hear you. Thank you. Our next speaker is Amanda Bedanza, a longtime resident of the South End of Boston. Amanda, you're a dental hygienist, I know by training, now is an entrepreneur with her own business, and she can tell you about that. Amanda is a volunteer with Compassionate Choices and lost her husband to cancer 2 years ago at a time when no law protected their choices. Amanda, how did that go?
This one?
Yeah.
So my involvement in the Aid in Dying movement began on July 13th, 2011, when my husband, TJ, at just 28 years old, was diagnosed with stage 4 colon cancer. At the time of his diagnosis, his disease was not terminal. Sorry, it comes and goes, so bear with me. At the time of his diagnosis, the disease was not terminal. His medical team was confident that with surgery, chemotherapy, and radiation, the disease could be controlled. TJ was on a path to a cure and was willing to try any treatment option that was available. About a year later, in 2012, TJ brought up the topic of medical aid in dying for the first time. He learned that the Massachusetts Death with Dignity Initiative, also known as Question 2, was going to appear on the November 6, 2012 general election ballot in our state. TJ explained to me that this legislation would be crucial to his care if his cancer ever became untreatable or terminal. The law would provide an end-of-life option for him and other terminally ill adults who have a prognosis of 6 months or left to live, to request, obtain, and if suffering becomes unbearable, self-ingest medication to bring about a peaceful death. After voting in support of Question 2, we were disheartened to learn that the measure had lost 51 to 49%. TJ knew that without this legislation in place, Massachusetts law would deny him the option of accessing medical aid in dying if he ever needed it. Since the legislation did not pass, TJ researched other states that authorized medical aid in dying, and we learned that Vermont was the closest that offered the option. TJ and I are both big skiers, and Vermont is a place that we visited quite frequently. So one weekend, we took our dogs skiing in Vermont, and it was after a walk that we took where he turned to me and he said, "Babe, if shit ever gets bad, we have to move to Vermont." I told him I would support any decision he made, and if moving to Vermont is what he wanted to do, then that's what we would do. But we always hoped that it would never get to that point. Unfortunately, after battling the disease for 4 years, TJ's prognosis changed and things got bad. In August of 2015, he stopped responding to treatment. The disease metastasized, and TJ's liver was failing. Chemotherapy, radiation, and clinical trials no longer remained an option. His prognosis was grim, and we were devastated to find out that there was not enough time left for us to move to Vermont to establish residency in order to access medical aid in dying. It was too late, and the only option he had was hospice. So that's what we did. And his hospice, the nurse, the staff, were dedicated to making TJ as comfortable as possible, and they were committed to ensuring our needs were met. But as his organs failed, his pain stopped responding to palliative care. Not even the highest dose of Dilaudid, which is 4 times stronger than morphine, could ease the pain. So as a result, TJ endured weeks of unnecessary suffering and spent his final days in great pain. October 11th, 2015 is the day TJ passed away in my arms. And only at that moment was he at peace. Before TJ's passing, I made a promise to him that I would fight for the passage of medical aid in dying. I want other terminally ill individuals to be able to direct their care in a way that TJ was unable to. Like many family members, I never imagined spending my time advocating for end-of-life care. But after witnessing what TJ had to go through, I'm committed to the promise I made to him, and I'll do everything in my power to make sure that others don't have to suffer the way he did. Thank you for letting me share my story with you.
Thank you very much, Amanda. Dr. Terry Bard has been a member of the Harvard Medical School Department of Psychiatry since 2000 and you're a young guy. You're a young guy, and I was going to say something like 2006, but I knew that was wrong.
1976.
Dr. Bard is also a member of a physician-patient clinic or workshop run as part of the medical school. So he's had a great deal of experience in a whole host of settings with physicians, with patients, with family members, often involving serious illness. He's an ethicist by training. He's a rabbi. He's thought deeply about the kinds of experiences that Amanda has gone through, and has his own reasons for coming to support this particular legislative approach. Doctor?
Thank you, Senator. Senator Barrett. Is this moving? Hello, can you hear me? Oh, okay. My journey to support this move has been one that has caused me to go through many changes. In Jewish tradition, if one looks at the literature, it does give leniency for withdrawal of services if someone is on a trajectory to die. But it clearly indicates, at least by the stories and narratives that you can find, that anything to do to hasten one's death is forbidden. Early in my career, I wrote about that. I really abided by that particular orientation. and even helped to advocate it as a clinician at the Beth Israel Hospital then, where I created the first ethics program. It was the first in the city as well. But as I spent many years as director of pastoral care there and providing personal clinical care as a psychologist, doing a lot of thinking and experiencing a lot of things, I grew to learn a great deal about life's passages. And one of the things I realized, holding many hands of many people who were dying or going through the dying process, receiving bad prognoses, is that there were many things going on that were important in their life, that they began to think about life's meaning and their own purpose. At the same time that that was happening in my career, things were happening politically as well. And there became legislation that really endorsed patient autonomy in decision-making processes, so that now each one of us sitting in this room has a right to accept or deny clinical care. In fact, the first bill of patients' rights started at the Beth Israel Hospital. I don't know if you knew that. It started the whole trajectory throughout the country. And so at the same time that I was going through thinking about this, I also was aware of the fact that end-of-life care was very important. I was on the committee that helped to set up the long-term proxies that many of you may have filled out. And if you haven't, I encourage you to think about it. The advanced directive, as it's called. And I grew to understand that there are many kinds of suffering. And Amanda, you pointed out the physical suffering, but there was additional kind of suffering. And that suffering was suffering which I would list in two ways. One is psychological, because I come from that tradition, and one is spiritual, because I come from that tradition as well. And both of those kinds of sufferings were never addressed or even acknowledged in the medical community. Physicians were certainly aware of and tried to reduce suffering in every way possible. The hospice movement was designed to help that happen in a comfortable, supportive environment. But the fact is, very few people address that particular element, even though hospice provides for spiritual care. There was no mechanism for people to be able to express their wishes in a spiritual way. And many people throughout my career were asking and saying, it's time. I've had my time. It's time for me to go. What can I do? They would beg it of physicians, and everyone's hands were tied. And I realized that in the era of patient autonomy, it's inconsistent without giving people the right to be able to extend that choice-making up to the very end of their life, because they can make it at any point in their life up to the time when they're perhaps on their decline. So I think from a rights perspective, it's the right thing to do, because that right continues to exist. I also think that it's important to support the spiritual side. Most people who actually elect to join the program to be able to have assistance in dying actually don't execute that wish. But what it does, by giving them that honor, is the ability for people to feel that they are in charge. And what I found over time is that those people who do so, their sense of spiritual distress and psychological distress is reduced. And from that perspective, I think we have to honor their wishes. There's much more I could say, but I think the important thing is that it's the right thing to do for all of us, that we should all have the capacity to be able to have to express our wishes and to have them honored with the help of other people. By the way, everybody does so voluntarily. Physicians who choose to honor these wishes as well do so voluntarily. There's no reason why they should be held in a legal limitation not being able to do so. I can talk more if you have questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Terry, very much. Dr. Cherie No is a physician, a geriatrician, an assistant professor of medicine at the Harvard Medical School. She's been associated for some time with the Quimby Center for Geriatric Care at Mount Auburn Hospital. She has over 20 years of experience working with patients, oftentimes very ill patients, in their various professional roles and at all stages of their lives. And Dr. No, you've heard the other three panelists, and maybe you want to clarify some points for us or address some issues that you feel have been raised.
Sure. I think a common question that comes up is if we have good palliative care and hospice care that can provide care both for physical suffering and psychological suffering, why would we need something like medical aid in dying? And I think we've heard a couple of examples tonight of how hospice care can sometimes not be enough to provide care at the very end of life. I think it was Woody Allen who said, "I'm not afraid of death, I just don't want to be there when it happens."
Right.
And I know when I speak to my patients and when I think of what I want for myself, we all wish that we could close our eyes and not wake up, and that our death would be that quick and easy and just the way we would like it to be. While hospice provides these medications to provide relief from pain and suffering, the intent is not to hasten anyone's death, and your death will take its natural course. And dying is generally not a fast process. It takes time over days and weeks, over which time people lose their ability to walk and talk and eat and lose their quality of life. As Amanda's experience shows, some people suffer incredible pain, but in many cases, there's a lot of suffering even without pain. There's the loss of autonomy, the loss of quality of life, the loss of dignity, the fear of the unknown, that make that very end of life so stressful, not only for the person who's dying, but for the people who are caring for them. And a lot of the suffering that people feel is the suffering of, what am I doing to my loved ones, that they're going to have to take all this time off from work and be there and go through all of this as well. So, well, when I think of this, I think, what would I want for myself? It's always the question I ask. It's the question many of my patients ask me. What would you do if it were your mother? What would you do if it were you? And I know for me, I would want the ability to have the choice to end my life when I wanted to end my life if I was terminally ill, and not have to wait for the vagaries of time for that to happen. It would be lovely to be able to put on a sweater, put on my makeup, have a nice dinner with my family, say my goodbyes, and go to sleep. I think that's what we would all want.
Thank you, Doctor.
Yeah.
Comments, questions from the audience? Why don't you come on up to the mic and introduce yourself if you're comfortable doing that. It's not a necessity, but...
Yes, my name is Margaret Brooke, and my doctor and I have signed what I believe is called a MOST form, medical orders for life-sustaining treatment. I'm not sure I'm getting that right. Can you tell me what that means, and do I need this as well that you're talking about, the death with dying law? Thank you.
I'll take it. I keep forgetting the mic is here. Actually, you can't do that in advance. You have to, in order to have medical aid in dying available to you, you have to be terminally ill, diagnosed with 6 months or fewer to live. And that has to be confirmed by 2 physicians for you to be eligible to request medical aid in dying. So it's not something you can do in advance.
Also, the reality is, right now, You can't ask for that
Right.
in Massachusetts. That's why we're talking to you. We want that to be available to all of you.
Other,
Yeah, I would like to
let's-
just add a little bit more to this, just to say that,
why don't you, actually, why don't folks step up at the mic if they'd like to, so we can form a queue? I think that would probably make the most sense, but Marie's going to provide a little more context here as well.
I want to elaborate a little bit on both on what Terry said and what Cherie said, which is that, in Oregon, medical aid in dying has been authorized for the past 20 years. So we get annual reports from the Department of Public Health. And it's every year, it's like 92, 93, 94% of the patients that choose medical aid in dying are in hospice care. And a third of the patients that choose medical aid in dying end up not using it. And as Terry said, because they get some peace of mind just knowing that if things get so bad, it's available to them. So just
Hi,
Hi, I'm Judy Friedson, and I have a question. One of the most devastating diagnoses is dementia, and it psychologically, medically, and financially. And I know many, many people with the onset of a dementia diagnosis would like the option of aid in dying, so they don't have to go down that typical trajectory. So I'm wondering how this might play into this.
I can take that question. Sure. So, because of the way the legislation is written, you have to have the capacity to make the decision and request the medication at the time that you're terminal. So if you're 60 years old and are just beginning to have some memory impairment, you cannot put the request in place in the future. So people who do not have the capacity to make their own decision, if their dementia is advanced enough that they're at the end of their life, they would not have access to this.
Dr. Bard, let me frame it different, because Dr. No raises an interesting point. Granted, the Massachusetts legislation, possibly modeled on Oregon's and other states, says that today. Anytime you draft a bill, it's always an attempt really to create a conversation with your colleagues and with your constituents. Bills can change as their attitudes change. Is there a ethical reason why the judgment about hospice needs to have been made first as a trigger, or do you imagine that the alignment of hospice and medical assistance in dying, that is political in the sense that it seemed like a fig leaf or a rationale that one needed to embrace?
I answer your question first with a story. We tell in the Jewish community, is there any one thing that two Jews can agree upon? And the answer is what the third person should give to charity. Now, I say that because people misunderstand that ethics makes a decision in one direction or another. Ethics is logical discussion. So you can find an ethical argument on all sides of arguments. It's pretty much like law works. So that's the first response. The second is that people do not get a decision about hospice. What they get is they get a diagnosis that indicates that they're likely to die within a period of 6 months. So that's the important thing.
So that's a medical judgment.
Hospice is a choice of care that might follow from that. But there's no diagnosis to hospice. It's a choice that people make in terms of the kind of care. But I want to amplify a little bit as well, Cherie, what you said, and that is there are limitations. And one of the things when you're changing or advancing a law, you have to go very, very narrowly and try to make something that will work well for all people, but does not become so broad. In ethics, we call it the slippery slope, where we think that the ball's Tyrolean and it keeps on going and encompasses everything. So certain things are not included, as you suggested, in terms of an early onset dementia. That's not you're not given 6 months left to live, and it wouldn't qualify. There are other diseases as well, such as ALS, which do not qualify for this because the bill also restricts it because the patient, him or herself, must be able to take the medication, so that there's limitations both cognitively but also physically. So
Let's go back to our audience, but that's a provocative set of points that we can perhaps, Larry.
Hi. Yes, my name is Larry Hall. I came to this country as a teenager 68 years ago, and I've lived in Lexington for 52 years now. I don't have so much of a question, but a piece of information I find many of my elderly friends do not have, so I just want to make that point. It also related to dementia. You know, we all talk about physical decline that we all are aware of very much, but mental decline is also a serious issue. And euphemistically, we call it a long goodbye. You know, the extreme form is Alzheimer's. And I've seen people who have suffered this. And my concern is, even though we can give advanced directives and so forth, we may get to a point we cannot make our own decision anymore. And we slip into that mode without really knowing it. So one thing I find is that you should do mental exercise. In addition to physical exercise, there is online something called Lumosity.com. They test your mental capacity in many different dimensions. And you sort of like playing a computer game. It costs $6 a month. You could do it every day. And I've been doing that for 7 years. And the best part is they keep the record of your performance. So you know if you're suffering serious mental decline or not. And that I find very useful. Because then you can sort of make decisions while you're still able to. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. That's interesting. Let's have some more questions and statements here at the mic.
I want to say a little bit more about dementia. Although it's not included in the bill, we do recognize it as Compassionate Choices. As a national organization focused on end of life, we do recognize it as an issue for many people, and many of us are thinking about it. If you go to our website, and when we go out and go into the other room and look at our material, you can see what our website is. And we do have a dementia provision, where you can give a letter to your physician that says, for example, if I am unable to recognize my family, if I am unable to feed myself, I don't want to be fed. So you can put things like that into place. It's not the be-all and the end-all, but there are, some things that can be done. If you don't, there are people, I've done music over at the Neville for years, and there are people that have to be fed, that don't know where they are or who they are, and they have to be fed. Well, you can have that in advance, saying, I don't want to be fed if I cannot feed myself. And then you would let nature take its course. It would take a couple of weeks, but, no food and no drink, and you would pass.
Thank you. Yes.
Hi, I'm Bob Greif. I've lived in Lexington a long time too, but not as long as you. With all this support that you mentioned, Senator, 45 legislators, I have a very simple question. When are we going to have an initiative on the ballot again?
So
The last was 2012, you said?
the procedural answer is that initiatives do have to come from the grassroots. They don't originate in the legislature, so enough time has elapsed, and another campaign could be waged legally or conceivably in 2020. I would mention, just to show you that perseverance characterizes other campaigns, that the progressive income tax has been put on the state ballot 5 times. It didn't make it onto the state ballot for 2018, but one does need to raise, even when these questions succeed, and they often do ultimately, you typically tend to need to raise them more than once because there's a public there that needs to be engaged. People need to get their heads into this. That's what our terrific speakers are doing. And I can tell you from experience, it doesn't have to do with this sensitive question. On any big idea, carbon pricing, let's say, people need years to process the notion.
Yes.
And this is an issue that shouldn't be dropped because it's been tried once and failed.
Right. Has there been a national kind of uprising from people? We hear about it here in Massachusetts. Is there sort of a,
There's,
across the
there's
country?
a huge movement across the nation.
That's what I thought.
Medical aid and dying is
Yeah.
authorized in 7 states and the District of Columbia.
Oh, it is?
Some passed legislatively. Oregon and Washington passed by ballot initiative, California legislatively, Colorado by ballot initiative, Vermont by legislation, Hawaii by legislation, and the District of Columbia. We are doing it legislatively here in this state. Ballot initiatives, the reason we lost it last time is because we didn't have the $5 million to match the opposition that put the...
Talk about the opposition, Marie, and be explicit. Who put up the money on the other side?
I mean, I'm not going to name specific organizations. I'm going to say that organizations that did not want to see this go through.
I mean, I happen to be a Roman Catholic. Was the Catholic Church
The Catholic Church
interested?
yes, the Catholic Church put up a good deal of money.
On the
in
other
order
side,
to-
you're
Yes, yes. So, you know, so our goal and the way we're seeing it move is that, you know, no social change, and the senator will tell you, no social change happens overnight. It is a process. And where we were in 2012 and where we are today is huge. And we have made, you know, a huge movement. It may not look that way from where you're sitting, but in order to go further, in order to get, you know, the 46 legislators that were on board for this session to double that, we need you. You know, we need you to reach out to your family and friends across the state and say, talk to your legislators. You know, we need you to gather folks in your home to talk about it, you know, and get people involved. It's not going to happen if we up here do it. It's only going to happen if you become active and say, it matters enough to me for me to put the time in to write the letter to my legislator or to call my friend that lives in, you know, Lowell or that lives in Braintree and say, hey, are you familiar with this? Are you talking to your legislator? That's how it's going to happen.
Nicely, beautifully said.
Hi, I'm Joan Wittig. I live in Lexington for many years. Thank you for coming because there's a lot to think about and it's very hard to think about. And there are some very sad stories. But I have a specific question perhaps for the doctor. I'm disappointed to hear that the physical suffering cannot, as described, cannot be better controlled than what I heard. It was my understanding that with all the tools available to the doctors, not only the pain medicine, the very strong pain medicine, but the anesthesiologists have now the fentanyl to be used in a good way, and other very strong medicines that can subdue suffering, I thought, perhaps to the extent that breathing is then diminished to the point of death, but at least the suffering, the physical suffering, can be better controlled than what I'm hearing. Is that not the case?
Good question,
So there are a lot of medicines available, and there is no top dose of medication that can be given. So we can just keep giving more and more and more medicine. There's something called palliative sedation, which can be used in extreme cases. I'm not sure why Amanda's husband was not offered this, but where a person is essentially put to sleep with the same kind of medication that you would get for a colonoscopy or for minor surgery, which essentially just puts someone to sleep while they die over days. But sometimes especially if people are young and robust and have been on narcotics for a long time. They require higher and higher doses, or they may have vomiting and nausea and side effects from the medications that limit the amount of pain medicine that they can take. Or they may have hospice nurses who aren't present for the amount of suffering that's there and offer something more, so the family is left struggling. Remember, most people on hospice are dying in their own homes with their spouses and children administering these medicines and trying to provide this care at the end of life. So there are many things that go into the experience, and it's not unusual for families to have an experience that's not optimal with hospice, because it's an incredibly stressful time when someone's actively dying. It's very stressful.
Amanda, do you want to add to Dr.
Yeah,
Rose?
I just wanted to just add on that. So the reason that TJ could not have the sedation is because TJ wanted to pass at his home with me and his family. To do the sedation, TJ would have had to be in a hospital. He has to be monitored, and he did not want to pass in a hospital. He wanted to be at home with me, our dogs, and his family.
Let me also suggest that, in addition to what you said, we in medicine know about something that's called the principle of the double effect.
Double effect, yes.
And almost any medication, you know, you look at what are the side effects of medicine you get, because almost anything you put into your body is likely to have a potential for doing something that you really don't want it to do, or that you can do and can be managed. And analgesia can offer a suppression of suffering, physical suffering, but you get to titrate it to a point where you know that if you do a little bit more, that the likelihood of that second effect is going to take effect. And someone will, their breathing may be curtailed. And I would suggest to you that that does go on. It goes on, and it's been challenged in the courts, because sometimes people have asked, well, did you intend to kill somebody? And the answer usually is, of course not. People wanted to reduce people's suffering, but in the process, knowingly, usually with family consent, because patients oftentimes at that point can't grant consent, that with family consent, they go up to a little higher dose so there is less suffering. So this often will take place, but not everywhere and not universally. But it's happening routinely and has been happening in medicine for decades, and we know that. And we have to be honest about it.
Let me
People
ask,
don't
if I
understand.
could put a question to the panel. Let's talk about the politics a little bit. I have a general interest as a legislator in where the opposition is going to come from, not in terms of the money. I understand that backstage things could be happening, but there are also going to be people out front opposing this legislation, actually testifying on the other side and trying to make human appeals of their own. And it's an interesting question as to what those messages are going to be. I recall one point that was made by advocates for the other side more than once, and I'd be interested in our panel commenting on it. They would pick apart the logic that suggests that determinations that one has 6 months to live can be relied upon. So they would tend to put up witnesses to testify before legislators who would say something like, I was told I had 6 months to live, or my loved one was told that she had 6 months to live, and 2 years later they're doing fine. And had this been available in our low moments, we might well have considered it. And then they'll wrap up with a flourish, thank goodness we didn't have that option. So what do you do when you're standing before an impressionable legislator who's heard that this 6-month test can't be relied upon?
My own sense is that I think most people don't really realize, and most doctors do understand, that every time we go to a doctor and they do an evaluation and they give you a treatment, they're working on a bell curve. And so every person and every treatment is really an experiment. Hopefully it's all designed for the benefit of the patient. That's the goal. And that usually the numbers will suggest that things are going to go fine with whatever medication that you get. But we always know that it's not 100%. It's rarely 100%. So you really don't know. There's more and more and more clarity about when somebody is closer to death than not. But it is imperfect. And so you are going to find outliers to the story. There's no way of avoiding that. So it's reasonable, I guess the medical community has sort of decided it's reasonable to look at a period of time when within that period, most people who have such and such a diagnosis are not going to be able to endure much longer than that. And that's, it's not arbitrary, but it's not exact. And so you will hear those stories, and there's no way of saying that they're wrong. If you have someone that fortunately turns around, these happen. I think one of the resistances that we've found is that there's an internal definition that many of us get about certain principles in life that come from a variety of places, our families, our environment, sociology, the social community, or our religious orientations. And if something is in violation of that, or seems to be in violation of that, and we haven't grown to question some of those principles, then a lot of people fall back on principles that they have been taught over time, and they hold them very dear. How many of you find it really easy to change your mind? You know, change is the only constant in life, but most of us are really resistant once we get our minds made up. And so when you have that, there's where the kind of resistance and traditions that do not approve of this, and they believe in autonomy only to a certain extent. And then they say, well, something else takes over. Oftentimes, most often in this particular discussion, it's a theological or religious reason that has come forth, and you will find that in the opposition. We find it in most religions, most religions that are more fundamentally oriented will find that perspective. That's just the way it is. Anything more you want to add?
Thank you very much, Doctor. Any other, Marie?
Yeah, I think that what I would add to that is that, you know, hospice uses the same definition. If you've been diagnosed with 6 months or prognosis of 6 months or less to live, then you're eligible for hospice. There are some people that walk away after 6 months, they go back home and they continue living. But that's not the rule, you know, most people don't. And the other thing that I would add is that people that avail themselves of medical aid in dying are people that desperately want to live. So they're not, you know, going to get their medicine and run home and say, oh, yippee, I have my medicine, now I'm going to take it and die. I mean, they wait until until the 11th hour where they can't have, there's just no way, there's no turnaround. It's clear there's not going to be a turnaround. And then they, you know, take their medication. So it's not like, you know, something that people are getting in line for.
Yes, hi.
I have a question for Amanda.
Yeah.
I want to hear how it has been for you to be involved in this movement and what that has done for you and what we can do to help.
Yeah, it's being a part of this and working with Compassion Choices. It's a way of keeping a promise I made to TJ so that other people don't have to suffer the way he did. Most of my family and friends support my advocacy. And as far as my religious background, I do want to mention that I'm Catholic. My husband is Catholic. I go to church every week, and I've had conversations with my priest about this. I've told him that I'm working with this group to legalize medical aid in dying, and after the discussions I've had with him, he didn't condemn me for doing this after explaining what happened to TJ, and this priest saw bits and pieces. He was there the night that TJ passed. He understands why I'm doing this. So I encourage everyone to, if you have a story, share it, because this is what legislators need to hear.
Let me make we have to close, or at least the appointed hour is upon us. Just a comment about political activism. Listening to this impressive panel myself and learning a lot, I can tell you that I realize that there's something distinctive about this issue that creates some possibilities, I think, for advocacy. There are some questions that really depend on masses of people and collective action. Many people in the audience have done political activism of one kind or another, and they know the power of numbers. This is different. This issue is something where we really can best relate to the question by listening to one person's story. And it's quite easy to put oneself in the shoes of one person who's been through this in a harrowing kind of way. That makes for a very efficient form of lobbying. It puts a lot of burden on a fewer number of people, but I'm going to hazard a guess, and that's that if you were to have Amanda or someone in Amanda's shoes with her kinds of experience talk to 10 undecided legislators, all 10 could not help. Each of the 10 would be moved by her experience. And I'll bet you that in liberal Massachusetts, 5 of those 10 would be willing to co-sponsor a bill that they, for whatever reason, hadn't co-sponsored before. 45 is a terrific start. There are 5,000 bills, though, that come flying at us within a concentrated 30-day period every 2 years. So I miss stuff that I would agree with simply because my staff and I are focused on another subject area. And we haven't attended to an issue that in a perfect world with double the staff we would have learned about. That's why persistence is so important. Information sharing is an inefficient exercise, but this is such a compelling and urgent need that all of us are going to encounter at some point in our lives or another, or something close to it, that you could take a limited number of people, you wouldn't have to depend on mobilizing the masses, you could probably see this bill in our 40-member Senate make substantial progress if you had a team of a dozen people with personal stories. So there's hope here because the power of the individual experience is so enormous. And that's why I think that this is bound for success. What a legislator can never predict is when, but this is the kind of issue that as boomers age and as the parents of boomers age, the numbers in support are going to grow and grow and grow. So I want to thank our panel for having, raised our consciousness in the best of ways. And I want to thank all of you for coming tonight. I think everyone's going to be hanging around after the formal I want to thank the church again for having had the moral courage to host us. And with that, we invite you all to chat informally. Thank you.
Thank you.
If this mic is still on, I would encourage people to join Compassion and Choices. If you want this to pass, if you want to have this option, Compassion and Choices is our organization working for it. They have a terrific website, but they're also lobbying on our behalf, so I'm sure there are membership forms out there. I'm fine.